Okay, so we're going to take a look at the Asteroids machine today. As you can see, the control deck is all set up just like the original Asteroids. What you're going to need to do is know where that A button is. If you saw my other video, you see I peeled off the sticker where the little A is. You can use the dial to move up and down and choose the game you want to play. Then you're going to hit that A button, which for this is the rotate left right there. And it's going to show you kind of a layout of all the different buttons and what you can use for the game, it does this for every single game as you start it. So you're just going to hit the player 1 to continue, and you're right into the game. So Asteroids was released in 1979 by Atari. It was developed by Lyle Raines, Ed Logg, and Dominic Walsh. And while working on Sprint 2 in 1976, Lyle Raines actually created what would become known as the Atari Arcade font, which was then used in countless Atari games over the years. Ed Logg actually developed Super Breakout in 1978, and he was then one of several developers on Centipede, Millipede, Gauntlet, and some other games. In Asteroids, you're essentially controlling a ship that rotates left and right and fires. You have a thruster that's got a little bit of fake physics in it. I tend to not use the thruster all that much, but I do it here just to give you a look at what you do with it. It's fake physics because when you let go of the thrust, you eventually slow down and come to a stop. But in space, obviously, in the absence of a gravitational force, you'd keep moving in that direction essentially forever. So it's not quite the same thing. But it makes the game actually a lot more challenging and fun. You also have a hyperspace button, which is for a last-minute escape, but you have a random chance of either blowing up when you reappear or hitting an asteroid right when you come back. So it's really a last resort kind of a button that you don't want to hit that much. So when Asteroids was released, it was a huge hit, and it was one of the first games, along with a pinball machine, to appear in the little neighborhood deli about a block away from my house, which was in the middle of a residential neighborhood. It was just bizarre seeing an arcade game there. And they got more over the years, which is cool. It's a tough game, of course, which you'll hear me say a lot about all these old arcade games, and they're designed to take your money and to get you to keep feeding quarters into them, so by necessity they're difficult. Asteroids itself was ported to the Atari 2600 and 7800 along with the 8-bit computers, but they all had like blocky, colorful graphics, which were different than the arcade game, but it was still pretty much the game. The 2600 one was so much easier, though. I could play that thing for hours. It skipped the Atari 5200, mainly because the non-centering joystick on that thing made the prototype that they tried to put together a nightmare to control. So it just was something that they decided to just drop entirely. This, like all the rest of the games here, it's arcade authentic. And the feel of it, the sounds of it, and everything. It's amazing. You can see the side of the arcade machine here looks exactly like it does in the arcade, but smaller. The marquee, the control deck, you can see the differences here. It's very much the same control deck, just smaller, again. But it has all the same graphics and everything. Same graphics on the lower part of the overlay there around the screen. They didn't go full on with everything else, obviously, because there are 3 other games here. So they didn't want to clutter up the sides of the cabinet, the sides of the screen with all the Asteroids artwork there. But for somebody who played this game as a kid, it really hits home. It is the same game, the same sounds and everything, and that panic as you get deeper into the game with that Jaws type thumping beat that speeds up. The game, it's a classic. So it's good that it was one of the ones that they picked here to be the marquee title, because it was one of the first big hits of the arcades. So I'll just go quiet now and let you see a little bit more of the gameplay in a minute. Actually, I forgot to tell you the high scores here. These are not saved. Some of the games, the high scores are saved when you turn the cabinet off. This and some of the others, for whatever reason, are not. And I'm not entirely sure why that was not the case for this. Something I do need to ask about. But, for a lot of the other games, they do actually save the high scores when you turn the machine off. When you unplug it, that's a different story. But when you turn it off and turn it back on, they're still there, which is kind of cool. What else can I tell you about this? The flying saucers you see there, you start with the bigger flying saucer, and eventually, as you get deeper into the level, the bigger flying saucer, its firing is not that accurate. The smaller flying saucer gets a lot more accurate as you go, and it will hit you like that pretty much immediately when it comes on the screen. So you better be moving, and you better be out of the way, and you better try to take it out quick, because it will get you as quickly as it can. And I think, yeah, see, I started moving here, and it still got me because it just gets deadlier as you go to make the game that much more difficult. And that's how the game was. Each level you start up and you've got more asteroids to take out. The flying saucer's coming quicker. The smaller one comes in almost exclusively at one point, just to make it that much harder. So, okay, so to get out of a game and get back to the main menu, you're going to hold down the one player button for 5 seconds. The screen will go dark and it'll kick you right back to that main menu. So let's jump into Tempest now. And the exciting thing about Tempest, you can see you're going to be using the dial, and you have a fire button and super zapper. But the exciting thing about Tempest here is that we finally have a home version of Tempest that's nearly perfect. Now I say nearly because the dial isn't exactly arcade perfect. In the arcade, the dial spins freely. You can just whip it around and it'll spin without you touching it. It will stop eventually, obviously, physics. But it allows you to get around all the different shapes here with ease. You can get very quickly from one side to the other, just spin it around real quick while you're firing and try to hit everything in an easy way. On the Arcade1Up machine, the dial has a click to it. Every time you turn it, it's a little click, 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 click. So there is a little bit of resistance there, and you're not able to spin it entirely in an easy way. You really have to move it. So it changes the game a little bit, but it's not terrible. It's not terrible. It's not bad. It's okay. I asked about why this was, because when I checked it out in the arcades, I thought, this is the way it used to be, right? Maybe I'm missing something. Maybe I'm forgetting something. Maybe this arcade machine had been modified in some way, but I thought this was the way it was supposed to be, with this free spinning. So I asked about it, and the people at Tastemakers told me that it was essentially the best one that they could source to get the machines manufactured on time. So they are looking into other options, and they may even revise the machine at some point in the future if they can get one that's more arcade-like in the way it spins, which would be awesome. At the same time, if you want the machine now, this shouldn't hold you back. It works well enough, and either way, it's 1,000 times better than the joystick-based control schemes for all the console ports and new versions of Tempest that are on the consoles that have come out. So Tempest was released in 1981. It was created by Dave Thurer, who also created Missile Command, and that is a huge game in the history of video games, and that is on the Centipede machine, and I'll talk about that in that video. This was also, interestingly, Tempest was known for a number of firsts. It was one of the first games to use the color vector display technology that was developed by Atari. It was the first game to use what Atari called the skill step, which is a fancy way of saying you can just pick your starting level. And it gives you a bonus when you complete that level. And you'll see it here when I start up again. So let me hold on for a second, and you can see. So you've got a whole bunch of different choices there for starting at higher levels. So it was a way to kind of continue your game, not really continue it, but jump forward to those levels that you may have died at, or at least close to the levels you may have died at, and you can jump right in with a whole new set of lives and get a bonus for completing it and moving on to the next level, which is kind of sweet. One of the other firsts was that it was one of the first games with a progressive level design, which means it would change things up on screen from level to level, along with making them progressively harder. So you see, you go from that square, you've got a triangle, you've got all these geometric shapes in each different level instead of the same static screen for every level as you go. And I apologize for my horrible play here because I am quite rusty with the game, and when I sat down to make these videos, I just sat down and started playing. I didn't do any warm-ups or anything, so consider these my warm-ups, these bad playthroughs of all these different games. So for home ports, ports were in development for the Atari 2600 and 5200, but they were never completed. There are a few prototypes out there for those different games, and one of the cool things is that the original programmer for the 5200 version, Keithan Hyenga, found the code and actually finished the port. And it was released on Atari Age a couple years ago for $50, came complete with a 5200 style box and a full color manual. So that's Tempest. It is awesome. It's arcade perfect, of course, and with the exception of the dial, and the dial is fine either way, it's the best version you're going to get of Tempest at home, because the console ports just don't do it justice with the control scheme. So now let's move on to Major Havoc. This was released in 1983, and it's actually the one I had the least experience with in real life. I never really played it before in the arcades, not that I remember. Outside of the Atari compilations and collections on the PC and PS4 and all, I didn't really know anything about this game. And I played it on the collection, the Atari Classic Collection 2, Part 2 for the PS4. But it was all new to me, so I did some research on it and was blown away, actually. I'm blown away by the game itself. The game is really cool. So it was developed by Owen Rubin. And of particular interest to PlayStation fans, some of the levels were designed by Mark Cerny. Yes, that Mark Cerny. That's, kind of a surprise. So the original game, interestingly enough, used a rollerball, trackball, and buttons for the control scheme. But only about 300 of those were made. And Atari then made a conversion kit for older Tempest machines, giving the game a new control scheme with that Tempest dial and the buttons, making the whole thing actually a bit more manageable. So Major Havoc is interesting, essentially, because it's a series of smaller games stitched together into a larger narrative. There's a mini version of Breakout in the corner of the loading screen back there. You'll see it again when I get back there, and I play it for as long as I can each time. What I didn't understand about that until I did some digging is that if you piece together the correct two numbers, like you rotate the dial to get the first number and then hit the button to start the ball moving, and if you can get to the other number, it will allow you to jump to that level. So you can warp ahead to that level depending on what the numbers are, and you have to get the right numbers. You can see it down there in the corner of my screen now, and I'm trying to play Breakout, and then it'll stop you after a certain point and kick you back into the game. So you start here. You're fighting these enemies coming at you kind of in a Galaga style, but in more of a 3D layout where they're coming right at you. And of course, it's all vector graphics, the color vector graphics, which makes it look cool. Once you bypass them, then you have to actually land the ship on the little white pad there, and then you're into the maze. And this whole thing, these are space stations from this race that conquered the galaxy, and they've all died out now, and you're one of the last humans. You're a set of clones. You're Major Havoc, and your job is to go and destroy all these space stations. They've all got automated defenses inside. They've got robots. They've got all these beams and things that will kill you if you touch them. You have basically the movement, a jump button, and a shield. And that shield will protect you for a couple seconds. And the idea is to hit the reactor there and then get out. Things freeze, making it really difficult to get out sometimes. So each time you die in that maze, you basically have to start over. Unless it's at a certain point in the maze and you've already set the reactor, then you move on to the next level. The cool things in the game, it mixes in these other challenges like this, where this maze gets built, and if you can destroy these things as they're building the maze, it becomes a lot easier to get through at least the lower part of it. Then you have to kind of work your way through the upper part of the maze, which can be really difficult, and you have to knock out all these enemies on the way and kind of make your way through without hitting any of the walls. So it's cool because the game mixes in all these other challenges, and it just kind of builds upon what you've learned, makes the actual space stations much, much harder each time you go. So it's very challenging and very, very fun. It's a wild game and that's the other thing there. Major Havoc has some cool idle animations if you just kind of sit there and don't do anything for a little while. But it's a pretty fantastic game, and I'm glad they included it. Because I played it a little bit on the collections, but I didn't really understand what was going on or what I was doing, and there were too many other games on that collection, the Atari Classic collection, that I wanted to play, so I just didn't actually play this all that much. And now I'm kind of kicking myself for not doing so. But I'll let a little bit of this play so you can get an idea of what it looks like and some of the sounds and everything. It's just a great game, really different from all the games back then. So I'll let this run for a little bit, and then we'll go into Lunar Lander. Okay, now let's move on to one of my favorite games in this collection, by far, Lunar Lander. So, this was released in 1979. It was designed by Howard Delman and Rich Moore. It was the very first video game to have multiple perspectives. So, up until that point, every game was played essentially on a static play field. And that's all you got. With this game, as you get closer into the terrain, the perspective shifts and it zooms in to give you a closer look on where you are, which allows for precision landings. And you'll see it coming up right here as I get closer to this mountain. I think it's on this one. Maybe not. Maybe I didn't get close enough to this one. Maybe I moved all the way over. But you'll see it when it happens. And the cool thing is, seeing that in the arcades, and that combined with the large thruster handle that was part of the arcade machine design, was certainly an eye catcher. So there you go, right there is the perspective shift, and suddenly you're in closer and you're seeing where you're trying to land. That's a 5x landing spot, so I'll get 5 times the points if I actually make this landing, which I just barely do. So the game has some physics to it. You basically rotate your lander left and right, and you're going to apply thrust to it to guide it in for a safe and gentle landing, or you're going to bounce and crash your lander, destroy it, whatever. You can actually land on any flat spot in the terrain, but for anything that doesn't have one of those points multipliers, you're only getting 50 points, so it's really not worth it. You got to go for the 2, 3, 4, 5x landing spots to get the highest points. So once you land or crash or whatever, it resets, puts you right back up, coming in for another landing. There's new score multipliers down at the bottom, and you just do it again until your fuel runs out. So the way this game worked is your fuel was actually purchased per quarter, and 1 quarter would get you anywhere from 1 to 3 landing attempts, depending on how careful you are with your fuel and really which areas you're going for, trying to land on. So this made it one of those early games that I absolutely loved, but I didn't play it as often because it wasn't necessarily about skill, but about pumping quarters into it to keep playing. You could be perfectly skilled and get 2 or 3 landings in, and then the game's over just because you run out of fuel, which always frustrated me. And I loved it, but I didn't want to keep pumping quarters into it for such a short experience. And you can't imagine how glad this makes me now to have a version of it where I don't have to put quarters into it. I can just play and play and play. And man, I do. I had to cut this video down because I could play this for an hour and just keep going and going. And it's cool because you can just keep hitting the 1 player button and pumping more fuel in, right up to, I think it's about 4,000 units of fuel, somewhere around there. So, I mean, there's not much else to the game. This is basically what it is. You're landing a lunar lander on the moon, and you just get to do it over and over again. And it's all about, keeping an eye on your altitude and your drift from left to right and your rate of descent and everything, and just applying enough thrust to not crash, essentially. So this is just a beautiful port of the game, just like all these other ones are. Replacing that giant handle, obviously I get it. I know you can't have that giant handle on this machine when the whole point is to make it authentic as possible, but you have to make some compromises because it's the only game that uses that, and putting that giant handle in there would take up so much space on this machine and would just kind of be superfluous. It was unnecessary. So you've got your left and right buttons and your thrust button. I forgot there's also an abort button, which I never use. The abort button, if you know you're in big trouble there, you hit the abort button, which is that hyperspace button in the middle, and it will just reorient you straight up. And there's a beautiful crash. It'll reorient you straight up and just fire that rocket, fire the thruster underneath your lander to get you away so that you can try to get a better landing in. But, you're going to run out of fuel at some point and the game is going to be over, which is unfortunate. But now that you have it in a home version, you don't have to worry about all the quarters you're spending on this game. So, and that's pretty much it. Those are the 4 games. They're all arcade perfect, which all the games are in the Arcade1Up cabinets. They are ridiculously fun if you're of a certain age. The kids who are not of my certain age actually seem to enjoy a bunch of the games. They like Asteroids a lot. They haven't really played much of Lunar Lander or the other ones. They played a little bit of Tempest, enjoyed them. So, they're really for anybody. These machines are for anybody. And obviously they're geared more towards somebody my age who grew up with these machines and who has that nostalgia. But it's pretty cool to have these retro arcade games like in a dorm room or wherever. You could even set them up in... you could even set them up in like a... you can basically put them anywhere. That's the cool thing about them. They are small. I'll do kind of a comparison with how small they are. They're really small. For an adult, you need to be sitting in a chair or a stool, which I am doing right there. Otherwise, it's a little too small. You get down on your knees and play, but your knees are going to be killing you after a while. So there is sort of a stand that you can get separately. They didn't have any available right now. I'm still trying to get a hold of one. I'll probably get one after they come out. Right now, they're the perfect height for the kids, so I don't really want to put any of them up on a stand. And if I do, it'll be, more for me, obviously, because they're not going to be able to reach the game as easily. That brings it up to more of an arcade height, so that you can play standing or just slightly leaning over, which we all did playing arcade games growing up. And it makes a difference. So it depends on, what your household is made up of. Do you have kids? You might want to keep it as is. And, the taller people in the house will just use seats or stools to play the games with the kids, who can then easily reach the controls. Otherwise, if it's just you and you're an adult, you might want to get the little stand that will raise up the height of the cabinet to make it slightly more manageable for you. Either way, these are fantastic games, and they're really great ports of these games. So I highly recommend any of these machines. I'll have the other videos coming as soon as I can get them done. Centipede will probably be next, then the Rampage machine, and then the Street Fighter machine. So keep an eye out for those here on PS Nation. And thanks for watching. I hope you enjoy. And I really hope, if this is your thing, these have helped you out and helped you out in making a decision, and picking one up, because they're well worth it in my opinion. And let's go out on that crash.